It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Brigid Bergin, in for Brian today. Now we continue our WNYC Centennial series, 100 Years of 100 Things, with thing number 16, 100 Years of West Indian Immigration and Caribbean American Life in New York City. We're heading into Labor Day weekend, which marks the return of New York City's annual West Indian Day Parade. And with that, as our news hook, we'll talk about the Caribbean diaspora in New York City and take some of your oral history calls. Our guest for this is Tyesha Maddox, Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Fordham University and the author of A Home Away from Home, Mutual Aid, Political Activism, and Caribbean American Identity. Professor Maddox will help us explore how the concept of a shared West Indian identity came to be, as well as the importance of mutual aid societies and other associations that incubated political activism in New York City. We'll also talk about some of the people who left their lasting political, personal, or artistic legacies on the city. Professor Maddox, welcome to WNYC. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, we can take your oral histories of the Caribbean diaspora in New York City. We invite you to call in and share stories of some of the West Indian New Yorkers who are significant to you. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text us. Professor Maddox, how far back can New York's Caribbean diaspora be traced?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because when we tend to think of Caribbean immigration to New York City, we generally think about the period after 1960, where we see like a large boom of Caribbean immigration. But we've had early waves of Caribbean immigration in the 19th century, as early as the 19th century. So right after emancipation in the Caribbean, we see some movement to the not the United States yet, but to the northern region of the country. And then we see a significant boom, I would say, in the early 1900s. That's when we see a significant and what historians like to call the first wave of Caribbean immigration. In my book, I look at this period between 1890 and 1940, specifically for that reason, to focus on this earlier period that's often not discussed as frequently of Caribbean immigration, who made really significant contributions to the American landscape and American history.
And can you talk a little bit more about that period and what was the impetus to immigrate here?
Yeah, there were lots of reasons we see Caribbean immigrants moving. The number one reason that continues to be a reason for immigration, we see climate change, natural disasters. We see job opportunities that were available in the U.S. Also, this is a period when we're talking about the early 20th century, a period where there were very lax immigration rules and how people could move. And so we see more fluidity in movement, especially with people of the Caribbean. We see movement throughout the Central America, South America. Those are where early Caribbean immigrants went for work opportunities. And then eventually they come to the U.S. Through these networks of jobs.
So just to kind of leap through time, getting to the early 20th century, there are a few neighborhoods that have long been home to West Indian communities here in New York City, places like Crown Heights and Flatbush. Has the geographic distribution of Caribbean Americans in New York City been consistent over the last century, or has there been much movement?
There actually has been a lot of movement, especially when we talk about Afro-Caribbean immigrants who tended to live in areas where Black Americans lived. And so in the early 20th century, we see a lot of movement in the Sugar Hill region, which is what is now Lincoln Center, actually where Fordham is located. We see a lot of communities of Black immigrants living in Harlem, especially in that early period that I look at in my book. And then we see a movement once we have around the end of the Harlem Renaissance that came with high rent prices, overcrowding. We see movement to Brooklyn for a lot of Caribbean immigrants. And that's when we see the movement into areas such as Bed-Stuy, then bleeding into Crown Heights, further into Flatbush and Canarsie and areas like that. More modern Caribbean immigration, we see areas like Forest Hill, Queens, that has large Caribbean populations, especially a Guyanese contingent. We also see lots of Caribbean immigrants in the Bronx, in the West Bronx as well.
The title of your book, again, is A Home Away from Home, Mutual Aid, Political Activism, and Caribbean American Identity. And you discuss the importance of mutual aid societies and benevolent associations in this period here in New York. How did these groups emerge, and what function did they serve?
So these are groups that had started post-emancipation, actually in the Caribbean, and they weren't necessarily called mutual aid or benevolent associations, but they were friendly societies, and they served as support systems or networks for recently freed people post-slavery in the Caribbean. And Caribbean immigrants who are coming to the U.S. often brought these ideas of mutual aid and collective action with them to the U.S., and they formed these mutual aid societies or benevolent associations to sort of serve as welcoming committees for newly arrived immigrants. It helped connect already established immigrants with recently arrived immigrants, and so basically built these social and kinship networks for immigrants, helping them guide themselves through living in a new city. The Caribbean, as we know, is very different from New York City, and so in many cases it was a culture shock on many levels for Caribbean immigrants. Sure. And so the mutual aid societies served as a buffer to help them acclimate to U.S. society.
Listeners, we want to hear your oral histories on the Caribbean diaspora in New York City. We want your calls to hear your stories of some of the West Indian New Yorkers who are significant to you. The number again is 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or text. We're going to start things off with Janet in Harlem. Janet, thanks for calling WNYC.
My pleasure. I love this show.
So what is your... Go ahead.
I'm so happy somebody is writing about the West Indian immigrant experience.
So let's hear your...
Okay. My story, there's actually a picture of my grandmother in Ellis Island. Many people do not connect the West Indian immigration to what was happening in Ellis Island. And I was really disturbed by that. I found an article right before the Ellis Island Museum opened, and I realized there's a picture of my mother's cousin. So I went in, and it turned out my family immigrated from both Trinidad and Barbados in 1918 and 1905. And the story of my grandparents was that my granduncle, Charles Pettiani, was a journalist in Trinidad writing against the colonial system. They basically told him he had no future, came to New York in 1918. But the opportunities for a black man were limited, so he went to City College, then Howard Medical School, became a doctor at age 40, wrote for Marcus Garvey's newsletter, and also was involved with the Pan-African movement for liberation of all British colonies. And I really think it's important that people understand that our history is the history of immigration and how we settled in Harlem and how we made an influence on the political and social life of Harlem during the 20s and teens. And there's an excellent book called Blood Relations, West Indian Experience in Harlem from 1900 to 1930. And I highly recommend that everybody read that book.
Janet, thank you for that wonderful call. I want to give Professor Maddox a chance to ask any follow-up questions or respond to that.
So actually, thank you so much, Janice. I feel like I need to interview you and learn more about your family's history.
I want to talk to you.
Yes, I would love to connect with you because this is exactly the reason that I'm studying this earlier period, because we often don't connect Caribbean immigration with this period of Ellis Island and being like the founding of American history. It's actually really funny you brought up blood relations. Irma Watkins Owens was my dissertation mentor and my advisor, and she was also at Fordham University, and so I worked very closely with her, and that book is the Bible. I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in looking at this early period of Caribbean immigration. That one and mine, of course.
Of course, by all means. And Janet, if you hang on the line, one of the producers will get your contact info so that we can pass it on to Professor Maddox. Let's go to Desiree in Brooklyn. Desiree, thanks for calling.
Hi, good morning. So my story, or my family story, is like the previous caller. I've been doing genealogy research on my family for some time now, but we do have relatives, my great-great-uncle, great-great-aunt, and another great-great-uncle who came over through Ellis Island around the time of World War I and one had a store in Harlem that he had for many years. Another one was I've been following them through the censuses and stuff like that. Another one was an elevator operator in Harlem. They settled in Harlem, whereas comparatively, both grandmothers came over in the late 1960s, with the domestic workers program, and they settled in Brooklyn. They're both deceased now, but both of them, that enabled my father and my mother both to eventually come up from Barbados to join them and us and so on and so forth. I also have family that worked in the farm workers program in the 1940s and 50s. They would come up from Barbados annually to pick oranges, to do other agricultural work, in different states in the U.S., and then go back and return yearly to do that. My grandfather did it, and another great uncle also did it.
Desiree, question, and I apologize if you said this and I missed it, but how did you do some of this research on your family, and what prompted you to do it?
I guess I'm sort of the family genealogist. I've been working on my family tree for about 15 to 20 years now. I do it with Ancestry, with Family Search. I used to go back to Barbados to pull their archival records, but now a lot of it is digitized, so I do it online through familysearch.org. I've also done DNA testing, which has enabled me to find out additional information about, our links and stuff like that. So it's time-consuming, but it's also very fascinating.
It is fascinating. Thank you so much for your call. Again, Professor Maddox, what are your impressions of that?
I think that's amazing that you're doing that kind of work on your family and your family's history. That's really awesome. I also think it's really great that nowadays that we have access to the archives. Back in the day, we'd have to go to the countries and sit on microfilm, and now a lot of it you can look up online. So it just makes it more accessible for everyone. I think also a really good point that a lot of that both of the callers brought up is this aspect of work, and the reason that many Caribbean immigrants were pulled into the U.S. and saw the U.S. as a place of opportunity for these job opportunities. But also important to point out is that even though they were coming for these opportunities, they were in many cases denied because of the times. They were denied work in their chosen field or their professional careers, and so they often had to take other jobs. It was funny that Desiree brought up elevator operators, because I spend a lot of time talking about elevator operators, and my students are like, what's an elevator operator? Can't even imagine a time when you couldn't just push the button. But those were often a lot of the jobs that Caribbean men took in the early 19 teens and 1920s. And also the domestic work programs. That is what brought a lot of Caribbean women, and the networks of domestic workers that brought a lot of Caribbean women to the U.S., especially to Harlem in that period.
Kind of linking back to one of my earlier questions as we were talking about some of those, kinship groups, benevolent associations. women played a really significant role. Striking that also our callers so far have been women talking about their stories. Can you say a little bit more about the role of women in these organizations? And then hopefully tell us a little bit of your own story.
Yeah. So women actually were often the majority of participants in these organizations. Women tend to be traditionally the harbingers of culture and passing on cultural traditions. And so we saw a lot of female leadership in these organizations. They were really important at this time because it was one of the few places, especially in a period where women didn't even have the right to vote or hold political office. Women were holding executive board positions, serving as president and vice president and running these organizations. They were the backbones in terms of organizing, programming, and just doing the day-to-day work of the organizations. They served as really important, I think, leadership, like training grounds for women.
How is the concept of sort of a shared West Indian identity developed and really evolved since some of those early waves of Caribbean immigration that you were talking about?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to remember that many of these immigrants who are coming at the turn of the century, they didn't necessarily see themselves as Caribbean. For many of them, someone from Trinidad, it was their first time meeting someone from Jamaica. It's not until they're in the diaspora, until they're in the U.S., that they recognize this shared sense of culture and identity. And it's the diaspora that tends to foster these shared traditions and values. And so we see initially many of the organizations are very island specific. So you'd have the Bermuda Benevolent Association or the Antigua Progressive Society. And then later, as maybe a decade or so goes by, then you see West Indian Mutual Aid Society or the Caribbean this. And so as they are in the diaspora and they are living in close quarters, sharing the same kind of work, then they recognize the shared identity and the shared experience of Caribbean, of West Indian, especially people from the Anglophone Caribbean who have a very strong sense of, at this time, they're still British colonies, so a very strong sense of British colonial pride or resentment that they rally around. And so that's where you begin in the diaspora to see these shared identities and the shared values.
Just one note of clarification. Are the terms West Indian and Caribbean interchangeable the way we've been using them?
Yes. So there has been a movement I've heard of people who see West Indian as a kind of as a negative, but within the Caribbean, the term West Indian is used. It's, of course, a misnomer. Christopher Columbus thought he was sailing to the East Indies, and he ended up in the West Indies, and so he named it West Indies, and so we see the term West Indian being used. Even today, my mom's family is from St. Lucia, and I'll see they'll write on the mail, St. Lucia, BWI, British West Indies. And so the term is still used, and it's used interchangeably with West Indian, yes.
Let's take another caller. Let's go to Mark in Lefferts Garden. Mark, thanks for calling.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. What's your oral history?
I have an interesting history. I've been here, since 1979. Do the math, that's quite many years. I'm Guyanese by birth. Came here with my family, emigrated as a child with my mom and dad. One of the things I wanted to add was, in the 70s, it was quite difficult for sort of middle and upper class or successful Guyanese in business to emigrate because a lot of Americans don't realize that countries like that don't just let you leave. You need a lot of tax allowance, police allowance, a lot of government things to keep their talent in the country, because this is something that more affluent or families that went away to school. My dad went to piloting school in the UK that was paid for by the Guyanese government, and part of that sort of contract is that you come back and work for for the government, which he did for many years and was quite successful. So when we left, my dad went away to Norway on a business trip, and my mom put us and packed our bags and sold a house and everything in about just under 2 weeks. And we flew to see my grandmother, who was had a military career in the Guyanese Army, and then further went on to be a secretary to the Guyanese ambassador to the U.S. at the time. So she had gotten residency and was able to sponsor us, but the country wouldn't allow us to leave as a family. So we went on a tourist visa with my mom, and then my dad, on his business trip, never came back, which was something that many Guyanese had to do to be able to leave the country successfully.
Mark, thank you for that call and for that story. Professor Maddox, I see you nodding. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing that story. I think that's a modern day issue that we're seeing, essentially a brain drain, right, of successful people leaving the Caribbean and not coming back, and that leads to issues that we see in the Caribbean now, with a lack of young people who are educated and talented not being there to contribute to the country. Yeah.
Professor Maddox, we have a listener who texted, I'm a Trini immigrant. Two of my favorite Caribbean New Yorkers are Shirley Chisholm and Hazel Scott. What is the speaker's Caribbean immigrant story, if any?
Oh, yeah. So I was born here in Brooklyn, which I like to call Caribbean New York, the capital of the Caribbean, outside of the Caribbean. My mom is from St. Lucia in the British West Indies. She immigrated right in time for high school. And every summer, and my dad's family is African American, they're from North and South Carolina. So different migration story, but migration nonetheless to New York. New York serves as the meeting point for West Indians and African Americans. And my mom would send me home to St. Lucia every summer. So as soon as school was out, till right before school started around this time, I would be in St. Lucia. And I felt really connected in many ways to even though being born in the U.S., I felt very connected to my Caribbean heritage. But it wasn't really until I went away to college and I took Caribbean history courses that I really became interested in our history and culture, and had a passion for studying and learning and writing about Caribbean history.
That listener also texted some of her favorite Caribbean New Yorkers. The great Shirley Chisholm got a shout out. Many Caribbean Americans have been, important political leaders in New York City politics over the decades.
And continuing now also.
Absolutely. The Clark family in Brooklyn, Congresswoman Yvette Clark, previously her mother, Una Clark. But let's listen to a little clip from one of those leaders, Shirley Chisholm, from our archives. Go ahead.
I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or fat cats or special interests.
That again, of course, was Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress, the first Black candidate for a major party's nomination for the President of the United States. Professor Maddox, can you talk a little bit about Shirley Chisholm's West Indian roots and how they may have shaped her politics?
Yeah, I think really interesting that Shirley Chisholm was born here in New York, but spent her formative years as a child growing up in Barbados. And she has often said in her book that upbringing, her West Indian upbringing, really helped to shape who she was as a person and help guide her in her political career. I also I imagine now, if she was still alive, how thrilled she would be about Kamala Harris being the Democratic presidential nominee. I just think it's like full circle, especially now that we're talking about the anniversary of Shirley Chisholm and then Kamala Harris sealing the Democratic nomination. I think it's which is something that she wanted to do, right? I think it's just really amazing that we've come full circle.
Can you talk just for a moment about the relationship between Caribbean Americans and African Americans in New York and how that's evolved over the last 100 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was saying, even within my own family, my dad's family is from North and South Carolina. My dad was born here in New York. His family's African American. My mom's family is my mom and my mom's family is West Indian. And that was something that got me really interested in how not only, because we're all Black, we're all African American, but how do we become Black in this country? And this idea of identity and shared values was something that was always really interesting to me. And so in my own studies and doing work, I saw that immediately West Indian immigrants folded into the Black community. It wasn't always without tension. There, of course, were many issues that arose from that. There were similar themes that we see today about this idea of West Indian immigrants taking African American jobs, trying to fill in these positions. And there were some cases where white Americans often would say, oh, well, we prefer West Indians. And so that also helped instigate some of the tensions amongst the group. But for the most part, I'd say we see a lot of unity with Caribbean immigrants and African Americans, especially if we look at something like the Harlem Renaissance. There were so many influential West Indian immigrants who were part of the Harlem Renaissance, helping to create culture and music and art alongside African Americans during this period. And I think that's really important, the ways in which Caribbean immigrants and African Americans work together to create this shared Black identity, this African American identity. When we look at some of the great African American leaders, many of them had West Indian heritage. And so like even W.E. Du Bois, his family was of Haitian ancestry. And so we have many of these cases in which we see African Americans and West Indians working together.
I want to thank all of our callers who shared their oral histories and texted their stories. This is the latest chapter of our centennial series, 100 Years of 100 Things. My guest has been Tyesha Maddox, Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Fordham University and author of the book, A Home Away from Home, Mutual Aid, Political Activism, and Caribbean American Identity. Professor Maddox, thanks so much for coming in and joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.